All right, we're going to continue our discussion of the muscular system. We talked about the first half of the muscular system notes. We looked at the different events leading up to the action potential in the muscle fiber, and then also the shortening of the sarcomere. So this is a nice little animation showing the events of the action potential in the muscle cell and how it leads to sarcomere shortening. So we'll watch this video briefly.
An action potential introduced at the neuromuscular junction is propagated along the sarcolemma of the skeletal muscle. At the T-tubule, the action potential is propagated on the T-tubule membrane into the interior of the muscle cell near the ends of the sarcoplasmic reticulum. The depolarization of the T-tubule membrane causes nearby voltage-gated calcium ion channels on the sarcoplasmic reticulum to open, resulting in an increase in the permeability of the sarcoplasmic reticulum to calcium ions. Calcium ions then diffuse from the sarcoplasmic reticulum into the sarcoplasm. Long filamentous tropomyosin proteins lie on two sides of the actin myofilament, covering up the sites where myosin can bind to the actin myofilament. Globular troponin proteins are attached to the tropomyosin. When calcium ions bind to troponin, this causes troponin to change conformation and move the tropomyosin. When the tropomyosin moves, this uncovers the myosin-binding sites on the actin, allowing myosin heads to bind and form cross bridges. The cross bridges play a role in muscle contraction.
So a cross bridge is where myosin binds to actin at the actin binding site. Here we can see on actin. And recall from the video, the troponin binds to calcium, so the calcium is released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, binds to this red protein here called troponin, which causes this rope-like structure, tropomyosin, to move out of the way and expose the actin binding sites for myosin. So we need calcium in order for myosin to bind to actin. Otherwise, without calcium, tropomyosin covers these binding sites and myosin will not bind and we will not have muscle contraction. So recall that an important role of calcium is muscle contraction. So that's just a review. Remember that there was a crossword puzzle that went over a lot of the events of muscle contraction. I highly recommend that you look at that crossword puzzle, try to work it out, making yourself familiar with the terminology. So we'll continue then from the end of our discussion last time and talk about what causes that muscle to relax after contraction takes place. So the first thing that has to happen is calcium, well, first of all, ATP will bind to the myosin head, which will release it from actin. So the muscle will continue to stay contracted until another ATP molecule binds to myosin and releases it from the actin molecule. So ATP binds, and then calcium that is bound to troponin will diffuse away and by active transport move back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So we need to lose the calcium at the binding site on actin, specifically troponin. We need to lose the calcium bound to troponin, and we need ATP to bind to myosin in order to get relaxation to take place. So moving on then, looking back at muscle contraction and what causes muscles to contract with different forces depends on how many muscle fibers are actively involved. So it's important that you understand the definition of what's called a motor unit. And a motor unit is a single motor neuron and all the fibers that it innervates. So let's look at this motor neuron here shown in red, motor unit number 2. So this motor neuron innervates, we can see 3 different muscle fibers here, so that makes up that motor unit. Here's another motor unit shown in blue. This motor unit, this neuron, innervates or stimulates 2 different muscle fibers. So depending how many motor units we recruit for an activity will determine how strong that muscle contraction is, because a muscle is made up of many different muscle fibers. So how this whole muscle is going to contract in terms of strength depends on how many muscle fibers are recruited into the activity. So if you lift up say a pencil off the table, what happens is you have a few motor units recruited. Some are turning off, some are turning on during the activity to give you a smooth muscle contraction, and it's certainly not a full muscle contraction. But now let's say, for example, a mother is with her child and gets into a car accident. They're thrown from the vehicle and the vehicle is on top of the child. We have seen people under extreme stress with the sympathetic nervous system dominating, secreting adrenaline, that will cause or give that woman the ability to lift the car off of her child. So demonstrating a great deal of strength because all the motor units in the muscle were activated. So that's the maximum contractile strength the muscle can have, is if all the all the muscle fibers are acting in that contraction. So when we recruit all the motor units in a muscle, we get maximal contraction. But it's hard to really know how much a muscle can contract because we can't simulate that experience in a laboratory. It has to be under extreme stress, and that's just not something that we can, make happen in a lab situation. So any stimulus that is below threshold when it comes to an action potential, you're not going to reach a contraction. You're not going to have an action potential, which means there will be no contraction. So we need threshold, just like we talked about in the nervous system. You have to reach threshold, that negative 55 millivolts. You have to allow enough sodium in to allow that action potential to travel down the motor unit to the neuromuscular junction in order to release acetylcholine and start the action potential in the muscle fiber. If we have a stimulus that allows the membrane to reach threshold, then you get contraction. So anything stronger than that is going to be just reaching threshold, so we can't get a stronger action potential. We kind of talked about that with the nervous system. Anything that is below threshold, you're not going to have any contraction. Anything that is any stimulus that is at or above threshold, you're going to get the same contraction because we can't increase strength by action potentials alone. The only way we can increase strength is by activating more motor units. So if we look at this graph here, it pretty much shows here we have a stimulus that does not reach threshold, so no motor units are responding or contracting. If we reach threshold, one motor unit will respond. But then if we increase the stimulus, so more motor units are responding, we're going to get more contraction. So this is not a graph of an action potential. Notice on the side here, it's not voltage, it's just strength of contraction. So this is just showing that the more motor units we respond, the stronger the contraction of the muscle. Till you get to a certain point. Till we get to this point here, we can see all the motor units are stimulated, they're all responding. Therefore, we have maximal tension in that muscle, and we can't achieve any more strength in that muscle because all the motor units are responding. So even if we stimulate it more than we do here, a supramaximal stimulus compared to just a maximal stimulus, we're not going to get any more strength out of that muscle fiber because all the motor units in that muscle are already responding. So looking at the contractile force of a muscle, it depends, one, on how many motor units are responding. So if we have a large number of muscle fibers activated, we're going to get a stronger contraction out of that muscle. If we have larger muscle fibers contracting, we're going to get a stronger contraction. For example, the muscle fibers in your thigh, in your quadriceps and hamstrings are much larger than the muscle fibers in your eyelid, for example. So you're going to see a distinctly larger contractile force from those larger muscle fibers. And also the frequency of stimulation. The more action potentials back to back that we provide to that muscle, the less it's going to relax and continue to deliver strength. And then if we stretch our muscles slightly beyond their resting length, that's going to provide for a stronger muscle contraction. For example, if you needed to lift something really heavy off of a table, you wouldn't start with your arms bent to lift it. You would probably straighten your arms out and then put all your force into that lifting that item off the table. Because we know if we start halfway through our movement to lift something, there's not a lot of room for contraction to take place. So we want to make sure we have the whole muscle stretched and then provide all that strength into the muscle contraction, getting more and more force out of it. So these four things are very important for you to remember in terms of what are some things that determine muscle strength, so I definitely recommend that you know this list. So where do we get the energy for this contraction? Well, we know it's ATP. We've talked about that with aerobic and anaerobic respiration. Important, we need oxygen for long-term muscle contraction, but when there's no oxygen available in the early stages of muscle contraction, the first thing we're going to use is stored ATP. Once the stored ATP is used up, then we're going to use a special molecule found in muscle cells, unique to muscle cells. It's called creatine phosphate. And creatine phosphate is a quick way to make ATP. It's faster than the aerobic pathway, so it's the next step in generating energy in a contracting muscle. Once the stored ATP is gone, then we use up creatine phosphate to make ATP. And then after that, the anaerobic pathway with glycolysis resulting in lactic acid is used. And then if we continue to have muscle contraction, then we'll move into aerobic respiration, which takes longer because there's many more enzymes involved. And the benefit of that is we get a lot more ATP in aerobic respiration. But the first few minutes of exercise results from stored ATP, creatine phosphate, and then the anaerobic pathway. And commonly the glucose that we use in the early stages is going to be stored glucose in the form of glycogen. Muscle is very good at storing glucose as glycogen, and the more glycogen stores we have, the more energy available for that working muscle. So here we can see that creatine phosphate gives up a phosphate to ADP and creates creatine as a waste product and ATP as an energy molecule. So that's where we get the ADP, which is a storage molecule, being converted to ATP. Is this phosphate is removed from the creatine phosphate and added to ADP to make ATP. And that happens with the help of an enzyme, creatine kinase. So when we see people that have been injured in an accident or have some type of muscle damage, we will often find large amounts of this creatine in the blood, which is a waste product as a result of using creatine phosphate. So people that may be just engaged in a marathon or an Ironman competition, someone who was in a car accident, maybe had some muscle tissue damage, someone that's been undergoing multiple seizures, we might find increased creatine levels in the blood. And because it's a waste product, it should be filtered by the kidneys. So if someone is undergoing, or if someone has kidney failure and dysfunctional kidneys, this creatine can build up in the blood and be a sign that the kidneys aren't functioning well, because it shouldn't be at high levels if the kidneys are functioning correctly and filtering that out of the blood and making it into or putting it into the urine. So you can see that the creatine phosphate is very quick at making ATP, but you only get one ATP, and the amount of energy we get from that is only 15 seconds. So it's used early in muscle contraction. It doesn't provide energy sources for very long. So different types of muscle contractions. There's two types, isometric and isotonic. Isometric basically means the muscle isn't moving, but it is contracting. For example, pushing against a wall. The muscle is contracting, so tension is increasing, but the length of the muscle fibers are not changing. So that's an isometric contraction. When you're standing up, for example, the muscles that are maintaining your posture in an upright position, they're not changing in length, they're just contracting. An isotonic contraction, on the other hand, is like if you're lifting a weight and you're bringing the weight toward you, so that biceps is shortening as it comes toward you, and then as you lower that weight back down, it's lengthening. So the concentric portion of that movement is when you're bringing the barbell or the weight toward you. You're bending at the elbow and the biceps is shortening. So we can see here the key word is shortening. Eccentric means the tension is being maintained, but the muscle is lengthening, so it's getting longer as you're lowering the barbell back to the floor. And we know that the eccentric movement of an isotonic contraction builds muscle faster and builds more strength than the concentric contraction. So when you're lifting weights, it's very important that you go slowly on the first movement as you bring the weight up, but then as you lower the weight during the eccentric movement, you want to make sure you're going just as slow, because that is really working that muscle and building strength. So Muscle tone is just a term meaning that we have a constant tension in muscles over a long period of time. For example, in our blood vessels, we have smooth muscle that have constant tone via sympathetic neurons stimulating them. We call that sympathetic tone. But that's constant muscle tone inside of our blood vessels to keep our blood pressure up. If we lost the tone in our blood vessels, our blood pressure would drop and we would not have blood flow to our vital organs. So we definitely need muscle tone inside of our blood vessels. And we also see muscle tone in resting muscles. If you've seen someone who never walked, for example, maybe a child with cerebral palsy, or a person that has suffered from a spinal cord injury, you'll see that if those muscles have no stimulus, they have no tone and they become very flaccid and they atrophy. So just having some muscle tone gives the muscle its shape and there's some amount of contraction that's occurring. So when our muscles have been overworked, we start to see fatigue set in. There's 3 types of fatigue. The one we have control over is psychological fatigue. Sometimes when a person gets near the end of their determined distance they want to jog, for example, they start to look at the distance or the time they've been jogging, and then they start to give themselves negative self-talk. Or at the end of a marathon, psychological fatigue can be very powerful and prevent someone from finishing the race or achieving the time they had hoped for. Muscular fatigue can happen when there's no more ATP available. Well, remember that we need stored ATP to begin the exercise, then we need creatine phosphate, then stored glycogen. When all of those stores are gone, then we have to rely on oxygen inside of the mitochondria producing ATP. Well, over time, again, if we don't have glucose, we can't make the ATP, and if we're not able to keep our respirations up and the blood pumping, we can't keep our oxygen levels up to make more ATP. So muscular fatigue definitely sets in and is going to prevent someone from running on and on and on if they haven't trained for that. Synaptic fatigue is due to a lack of acetylcholine. That is less likely to occur. We have a ready supply of acetylcholine constantly being produced, so we're more likely to stop exercise because of muscular fatigue or psychological fatigue. When someone dies, what happens, the thought is the muscles become rigid after death. And that is because when someone dies, the calcium from the external environment, as well as the calcium inside the sarcoplasmic reticulum, leaks out. The calcium in the sarcoplasmic reticulum leaks out into the cytoplasm of the muscle cells, binds all the troponin molecules, and starts contraction. So the myosin heads bind and contraction starts, but there's no ATP available to release the myosin head. Remember that ATP is required to release myosin from actin, so the calcium, it floods the cytoplasm from the sarcoplasmic reticulum at death, but there's no ATP being made anymore to release those myosin heads. But then over time, the muscle fibers break down and rigor mortis stops. So the first few hours after death is when rigor mortis takes place, but then it goes away and the body becomes soft again after the muscle cells break down and the cross bridges are no longer able to form because of just atrophy after death. So looking at the different types of muscle fibers, not all muscle fibers in the body are the same. So I want you to pay attention not so much in this middle category, but the first column and the last column. We have slow oxidative fibers and fast glycolytic fibers. Slow oxidative, another term for this is slow twitch. Think of a twitch as a single muscle cell contracting. So slow twitch fibers are very slow in their binding of binding of ATP and splitting to cock the myosin head and bind to actin. It's a slow process. So therefore, it takes a little longer for these fibers to respond. But when they do respond, you'll notice the rate of fatigue is slow. And if we look at what other things are available, myoglobin is a special pigment in muscle cells that helps them to bind oxygen. So if you have a cell with a high myoglobin content, that makes it very efficient on binding oxygen. And if we can bind oxygen, the pathway for metabolism will be the aerobic pathway. Again, many enzymes involved, so this pathway takes a little longer to kick in, but we get lots of ATP being produced. So marathon runners who are very good at marathon running probably have a high percentage of slow twitch fibers in their leg muscles. So as a result, they can go the distance, but it takes a little longer to get these muscle cells going. But once they're moving and in motion or in their metabolic pathway, which would be the aerobic pathway, they can go the distance. So if we look at these fibers under a microscope, they're dark in color because of this myoglobin content. They have a darker color because of that. And they have many mitochondria, a good blood supply. So if we look here, this would be an example of a slow twitch fiber. So this slide here is made of many different types of muscle fibers, but here's a slow twitch fiber, here's another slow twitch fiber, and here's the other type of fiber, very pale in color, very low in myoglobin. So if we look at this column here, low in myoglobin, but fast, very fast in its myosin binding activity to ATP. So therefore, when it splits ATP in the myosin head, it can bind actin very quickly and contract very quickly. So these are good for short burst exercises. For example, track events where you're just running around the track one time as fast as you can, or swimming events when you're just swimming across the pool 1 or 2 laps and you're done. Those are best accomplished with fast glycolytic fibers. So when you look at people that have athletic ability to the Olympic level, it's probably based on the types of fibers that make up their muscle cells. And you can't train a slow fiber to become a fast glycolytic fiber. All we can do is make these a little more efficient in what they do, and the same thing with these, but we can't convert one to the other. A lot of us are a combination of these different fibers. As you can see in the slide, there's some fast twitch here, and there's slow twitch here, and then there's the intermediate ones, the in-between cells, muscle cells here. So we're kind of a combination of these. But like I say, the Olympic athletes might be more of slow twitch versus fast twitch, depending on the event that they excel at. So if you ever looked at chicken meat, for example, the breast of a chicken, chickens don't fly very long distances, but they can jump up and fly straight up for a few seconds, and that's because the breast meat, which controls the wings, is white meat. So those are fast glycolytic fibers. They're pale in color, and they can do short bursts of exercise, but they can't go the distance. They have a low myoglobin content. If we look at the slow twitch fibers, that's the dark meat. Where you find dark meat in a chicken would be on the thighs and the legs, because chickens are very good at running and walking, so therefore those fibers are slow twitch. Now if you look at a duck, for example, ducks fly long distances, so therefore we would expect their breast meat to be dark as well as the rest of the body, like the legs, and that's exactly what we find. The duck meat is a dark meat overall because of being mostly slow twitch fibers. So when we exercise, what happens to our muscles? 2 things, depending on the type of exercise. First, we see in endurance exercises, so for someone who's going to be a marathon runner, with marathon training, we see an increase in capillaries, mitochondria, and myoglobin production to allow those muscle cells to store more oxygen. In resistance training, for example, someone who lifts weights, does some heavy weight training, we see capillaries and mitochondria increasing in those cells as well. So in both types of exercise, we see an increase in capillaries, increase in mitochondria. That's the body's response to the increased energy demands. But what we see extra in the resistance training, in the weightlifters, is we see more myofilaments, more myofibrils, and the ability to store more glycogen because of those increased muscle fibers, but not muscle fibers, but myofilaments, myofibrils. We don't see an increase in the number of muscle cells with resistance training. We just see an increase in the size of those muscle cells because there's more myofibrils and myofilaments inside those muscle fibers. So if you think about someone who does sprinting and track, they'll have very large quadriceps muscles. But if you look at someone who is in cross country, for example, and runs long distances, they typically have smaller muscles. But those muscles are very efficient at what they do. They're just not as large because of the changes that occur with endurance exercise is a little different than what we see happening with resistance exercise, which would be like weightlifting or short bursts of activity. But typically for anybody who's trying to start an exercise program and wants to run a marathon, they always recommend a little resistance training with endurance training to keep someone strong and prevent injury. So as we age, our muscle mass decreases. Protein fibers break down, the nervous system is slower to respond, and as a result of that, we have reduced muscle mass, more injuries related to tripping, and it's important that we still exercise to slow this process. Some of you may know people that are 80 years old and can get up and move around and meet the demands of their day because of exercise and being active in their early years. But if you're someone who is sedentary and doesn't move around a lot as a young person, then this process of aging on the muscular system starts a little bit earlier and is going to result in a weaker muscle mass as a person ages. So it's very important for us to stay active, to keep our muscles strong so they go the distance of a lifetime.